The smell hit before anything else, thick, sour, something between rancid fat and smoke and dried manure baking in early morning heat. A man's stomach clenched at it, not from disgust, from hunger, because that smell was breakfast. Welcome to Mystery Wild West, where we follow the real history of the American frontier, the version that smelled nothing like the movies. If this is the kind of honest history that keeps you coming back, make sure you are subscribed. There is a great deal more of it ahead. Today, we are going to talk about food on the frontier, or more precisely, about the absence of it, about what men and women actually ate, what they went without, and what that cost them physically and psychologically. Not the romantic version, not the campfire scene with the steaming pot and the easy laughter. The real version, built entirely around the problem of keeping a human body functional when the resources available to do that were barely adequate, and sometimes not adequate at all. Here is what most people assume about cowboys on the cattle trail. They assume those men ate rough but sufficient food, a hard-working meal after a hard-working day. That assumption collapses quickly under the actual evidence. Start with the cattle trail, because the cattle trail is where the problem was most visible and most acute. A cattle drive in the 1870s moved between 800 and 3,000 head of cattle across hundreds of miles of open country over a period of weeks or months, with a crew of between 10 and 15 men riding herd every hour of every day. Those men needed to be fed enough to remain functional, because a man who was not functional let cattle stray, fell asleep in the saddle, made the kind of small error that turned into a large problem before anyone realized what was happening. Feeding them was the job of a single person, the camp cook, called the cookie by the men around him, though the affection in that nickname was complicated and conditional and depended almost entirely on whether the food he produced was sufficient to keep the crew from reaching that hollow, quiet place that hunger produces when it has gone on long enough. What was in the chuck wagon tells you everything you need to know about trail eating: flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, a small quantity of sugar, bacon fat rendered from salt pork. That was the pantry. That was the entire range of ingredients available for weeks of daily cooking. Everything that went into every meal for every man came from that inventory, supplemented only by whatever the land happened to offer along the route. The men who built their working lives around cattle knew what to expect. They did not expect pleasure. They expected fuel, enough caloric content to get through the day. That was the standard. Not enjoyment, not variety, sufficiency. And sufficiency, on the trail, was harder to achieve than it sounds. The biscuits were a staple of every trail meal. The cook maintained a sourdough starter in a ceramic crock, a live culture of wild yeast that had to be fed and protected and carried carefully through heat and cold and rough terrain. If the starter died, there was no bread, not until a new culture could be established and matured, which took time the drive could not afford. The biscuits produced from that starter were not what most people today would recognize as biscuits. They were dense, heavy, chewy, in a way that resisted rather than yielded. They were gritty with trail dust that found its way into everything regardless of how carefully the crock was sealed. Often burned on the outside and damp in the middle. Men ate them every morning, and sometimes at midday, and sometimes in the evening as well, not because they were good, but because they contained carbohydrates, and carbohydrates were what kept a man upright and moving through a 12-hour day on horseback in summer heat. The salt pork was built entirely around the demands of preservation rather than the demands of eating. Cheap cuts of pork, fat-heavy and low-grade, packed into barrels and buried under coarse salt until the meat was cured through to the center. To eat it, you soaked it, sometimes for an hour, sometimes overnight. You were trying to pull enough salt out to make it edible rather than merely survivable. After all that preparation, the result was a piece of protein that tasted primarily of salt and age. The texture was somewhere between firm and leathery. Men ate it because the body's demand for protein does not negotiate, and because on the trail, salt pork was often the only protein available. The coffee was not a comfort item in any casual sense. It was a physiological requirement, treated with the seriousness that its function demanded. Brewed strong, boiled directly in the pot with the grounds left in, drunk from tin cups that burned fingers already raw from rope work and cold mornings. The coffee was bitter. It was gritty. None of that mattered. What mattered was what caffeine did to a body that had been awake since before dawn, working in cold air, sleeping on the ground, and doing it again the next day and the day after that. It sharpened edges that fatigue had blunted, and it provided the psychological anchor of a ritual, the smell of coffee over the fire before full light, in an existence that had almost no other rituals to offer. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes the way you picture the daily life of these men. The trail diet contained almost no fresh vegetables. For weeks at a time, sometimes for months, the men on a cattle drive ate nothing that had come out of the ground recently. No fresh greens, no roots, no fruit, nothing that carried the vitamins a human body needs to maintain the systems that keep it functioning properly. The disease that results from extended vitamin C deficiency is scurvy. Most people associate scurvy with sailors on long ocean voyages. That association is correct, but it is incomplete. Scurvy did not require an ocean. It required only a long enough period of eating food that contained no vitamin C, and the cattle trail provided exactly those conditions. Men's gums softened and bled. Their joints ached in a way that felt different from the ordinary ache of hard labor, wrong in a way that was hard to articulate. Wounds took longer to heal. Old injuries that had been considered closed reopened without explanation. The men experiencing these symptoms rarely understood what was causing them, because the scientific understanding of vitamins did not yet exist. They knew they were sick. They did not know why. That gap between the experience of a problem and the understanding of its cause is one of the most quietly difficult aspects of frontier life, being subject to something you cannot explain and therefore cannot properly address. Experienced trail cooks knew from decades of practical observation, rather than any scientific education, that something green helped. They did not know about vitamin C. They knew that when the crew passed through country where wild onions were pushing up through the soil, collecting and cooking those onions seemed to improve the men's condition. Wild mustard greens, cactus fruit when the prickly pear was ripening, cattail roots pulled from the margins of streams. These were not additions made for flavor. They were emergency corrections to a diet that was, without them, slowly undermining the health of every man depending on it. When a steer was slaughtered along the trail, the cook used everything. The word everything is not an exaggeration here. The liver was cooked first that same night, because liver spoils faster than muscle meat, and because the men's bodies recognized something in it they had been going without and responded accordingly. The tongue was boiled, the heart was sliced and fried. The kidneys went into a pot with whatever else was available. The intestines were cleaned, turned inside out, and cooked over an open fire. The testicles of young castrated calves were coated in flour and dropped into hot fat. Prairie oysters, the men called them. In a life defined by the monotony of salt pork and beans and gritty biscuits, they were as close to genuine luxury as most trail hands ever experienced. Warm, tender, rich in fat and protein, and different. Perhaps the most important thing about them, they were different from what had been eaten the day before and the day before that. On the trail, difference itself had nutritional value in a psychological sense that is not easy to quantify, but is entirely real. Think about that for a moment. The thing these men looked forward to most, the closest thing they had to a treat, was organ meat from cattle, not because of the flavor, because it was different. That one detail tells you more about the reality of the cattle trail than any dramatized account could. There are documented accounts of trail hands who quit over consistently poor food. That decision might seem difficult to understand from the outside, abandoning a paying job because the meals were unsatisfactory. But consider the actual conditions of that life. 12 hours or more in the saddle every day, sleeping on the ground in whatever weather arrived, hands raw from rope work, muscles that never fully recovered because the rest between days was never quite long enough. The food was the one variable the crew could see being managed or mismanaged in real time. When it was consistently insufficient, it was a signal that the conditions of their labor were not being taken seriously. And men who were already at the edge of what they could endure did not tolerate that signal indefinitely. Now, move away from the cattle trail and into the fixed settlements, the small towns, the homestead claims, the farming communities taking root across the plains. The challenge there was different, but no less constant. A homestead family on the Kansas plains in the 1870s or 80s was operating on the edge of what self-sufficiency could provide. They had planted crops. They had a kitchen garden if they had arrived early enough in the season to establish one, and they were preparing, from summer onward, for a winter that would offer nothing new and everything cold. A root cellar dug below the frost line was not a luxury. It was the physical difference between a family that survived the winter and one that did not. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, cabbage packed in crocks, dried beans stored in cloth sacks, smoked or salted meat hung from the rafters, jars of preserved fruit if there had been enough sugar to put them up. Each of these things represented a decision made in autumn about whether the winter would be endurable, and the quality of those decisions was something families lived or died by. The winters of 1886 and 1887 are remembered in the history of the Northern Range as the Big Die-Up, a sequence of early blizzards and extreme temperatures that killed cattle by the hundreds of thousands across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota. Ranchers who had spent years building their herds rode out in the spring thaw and found carcasses piled against fences and in gullies. Families who had been living on the margins found themselves below those margins overnight, with months of winter still remaining. What those families ate in the aftermath was whatever had not been consumed or destroyed. Cornmeal was the grain of the poor frontier, and in the hardest times it was the grain of almost everyone. Cornbread baked in a cast-iron pan, cornmeal, mush, boiled with water to a thick gray paste, cornmeal griddle cakes cooked on a hot iron and eaten plain because there was nothing to put on them. Children grew up on the frontier knowing what it meant to sit down to a bowl of cornmeal mush and nothing else, not as an occasional experience or a temporary hardship, but as the regular texture of daily life in lean months. They ate it without complaint, not because they were more stoic than children born into easier circumstances, but because the alternative was to go without, and the body's hunger is not impressed by complaints. Deficiency diseases showed up in frontier communities in patterns that medical practitioners of the era could observe, but not always fully explain. Pellagra, caused by a deficiency of niacin, a B vitamin found in animal protein and certain vegetables, produced a distinctive set of symptoms that appeared with troubling frequency in communities that depended heavily on corn as a staple. Skin that cracked and darkened in sun-exposed areas, digestive problems, confusion, and mental deterioration in advanced cases. It was a disease of poverty dressed up as something mysterious, and it spread in the places where the diet had been narrowed most severely by circumstance. Water deserves attention here because it is rarely discussed in any account of frontier eating. A cowboy filling his canteen from a stream on the open range was taking a risk he likely did not fully understand. The science of waterborne pathogens was not part of the practical knowledge available to most working men of the era. What they understood was that some water made people sick and some did not. The mechanism behind that observation was not clear to them. The observation itself was correct. Cholera moved through trail drives via contaminated water with an efficiency that was terrifying and seemed almost supernatural. A man who had been healthy in the morning could be desperately ill by evening and dead by the following morning. The speed of the disease, the violence of its symptoms, and the apparent randomness of who it took and who it spared made it one of the most feared things on the frontier. More feared by many working men than violence. The practical response to contaminated water among people who understood that boiling made water safer, even if they could not explain why, was coffee. Heavily boiled coffee. The boiling process that made coffee from grounds was also the process that made the water in the coffee safe to drink. Men who drank coffee were inadvertently protecting themselves from the waterborne diseases that their neighbors drinking unboiled water were dying from. The coffee ritual that defined frontier life had a public health dimension that nobody at the time was consciously aware of. Hunting supplemented the fixed diet in ways that were practically significant, even if they are often treated in popular history as adventure rather than necessity. A deer taken in the autumn was not a trophy. It was protein for the winter. A rabbit snared along the fence line was not sport. It was the difference between a meal and not having one. Wild game also had the advantage of being fresh, which the salted and preserved meats that dominated the winter pantry were not. Fresh meat has a nutritional profile that preserved meat cannot fully replicate. Frontier families who ate fresh game were eating something their bodies needed in ways that went beyond the simple caloric arithmetic of how much protein was in a given portion. The problem was that hunting was unreliable. Game populations fluctuated, seasons changed, weather that was too cold or too wet made hunting difficult or impossible. The family that depended on hunting as a regular part of its food supply was a family that accepted variability as a constant, and variability in a food supply, when the baseline is already low, is a particularly uncomfortable kind of risk to carry. Consider what you carry in your mind when you picture the frontier West, the wide landscape, the open sky, the freedom suggested by all that space. Now set that picture alongside the saddlebag, the strip of dried beef hard enough to resist a thumbnail, the cold biscuit from the morning fire, wrapped in cloth and flattened from being sat on for 4 hours, the canteen of water drawn from a stream that 1,000 cattle had crossed 2 miles upstream. That is what the freedom carried with it. That is the weight inside the image. And the men and women who carried it, who managed it day after day, across seasons and years, without access to the things that most people take for granted when they think about eating, those people deserve to be understood in terms of what their lives actually required of them, not in terms of the mythology that replaced that understanding with something cleaner and less honest. The frontier table was not a place of abundance. It was a place of management, of attention, of the careful application of limited resources to a problem that returned every morning with the same implacable demand. Feed the body. Keep it working. Do it again tomorrow. That was the real work of the frontier kitchen, and it was, in its way, as demanding and as consequential as anything that happened in the saddle or on the trail or under the open sky that the mythology has always found easier to celebrate. If any part of what we covered today changed how you picture frontier life, the beans boiled over a dung fire, the gritty biscuits, the scurvy working through a trail crew that had no idea why their gums were bleeding, which part hit hardest? Leave it in the comments. These conversations are genuinely how we understand what resonates and what to follow next. Subscribe if you have not already. The real history of the American West is a long conversation, and every episode is another piece of it. We will see you in the next one.